dawn of the nuclear age changed the dimensions of modern warfare and the world we live in forever. Now that the Cold War has come and gone, we are left with the legacy of our nuclear past and the uncertainty of our future. How soon could developing nations have nuclear weapons? What threat does nuclear waste present in the food you eat? Could our own nuclear power reactors become potentially devastating terrorist weapons? America's Defense Monitor presents a 3-part series, Nuclear Dangers in Our Midst. Discover what every American citizen needs to know about vital nuclear issues. This week on America's Defense Monitor.
During the Cold War, under the banner of national security, the United States designed and produced 70,000 nuclear weapons. In the process, we wound up endangering the health of communities around the country and contaminating tens of thousands of acres of land. This contamination includes radioactive waste that may remain a threat to human health for 240,000 years. How will America safeguard its citizens from the nuclear threat at home?
I'm Vice Admiral Jack Shanahan, Director of the Center for Defense Information. Welcome to the first installment of our 3-part series focusing on nuclear dangers. Americans are fortunate to live in a democracy where decisions are made openly after public debate. Unfortunately, the system doesn't always work. During the Cold War, nuclear arms race decisions were made behind closed doors for purely military reasons and without concern for the long-term well-being of American citizens. Today we're going to consider the costs, the consequences, and the dangers in this failure of our democratic process during the Cold War.
In August of 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. The Cold War heated up. America rapidly accelerated its nuclear bomb-making capacity, expanding to 17 major production sites by the mid-1950s. But in preparing to fight the Soviets, the United States succeeded in nuking itself. Protecting the environment and communities surrounding the sites from the deadly byproducts of bomb making was the last thing on the minds of the Cold Warriors.
It was produce. The Russians are coming, watch out, what's going to happen? And so we had to produce. We didn't want anybody to be taking over this country. And what are we going to do with the waste? Well, we'll put it out behind the plant. We'll worry about that on down the road someplace.
Democratic Senator John Glenn of Ohio has been a longtime leader in confronting the environmental problems of nuclear bomb making.
I think we were also concerned about the Soviet threat and our need to get the fissile material, the bomb material, produced and out there, and nobody wanted to worry about all this hard to contain and hard to control waste, and there it sits.
Ironically, while government films of the 1950s and 1960s taught American children to duck and cover from the threat of nuclear war, the United States was putting millions of its own citizens at risk with secret medical experiments, atmospheric nuclear weapons tests, and intentional releases of radioactive elements from nuclear test sites and weapons plants. Lisa Crawford is the president of Fernald Residents for Environmental Safety and Health, a citizen group in Ohio dealing with the ramifications of life near a nuclear bomb factory.
You know, the early years, I guess, were, they would never admit anything. Yeah, we lost some dust, yeah, we got some wells, you know, it's kind of this, but it's not really a problem, and you know, you really don't have anything to be worried about, and you all are just a bunch of hysterical housewives out there just raising hell for no reason at all. Years ago, in the mid-'80s, DOE kept saying to us, we've only released 300,000 pounds of uranium dust in your air. That seems like a lot to me.
In 1993, the General Accounting Office, the investigative arm of Congress, revealed that the U.S. military and Department of Energy's predecessor agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, purposefully released large amounts of radiation into the atmosphere to determine the practicality of using radioactive fallout as a military weapon. These radioactive releases occurred at the Oak Ridge Reservation in Tennessee, the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, the Hanford Reservation in Washington State, and the Los Alamos National Laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The 1949 Hanford experiment released radioactive iodine that spread for some 200 miles. Residents of the area found out about the incident many years later. That particular release of radioactive iodine was a deliberate experiment to see how far it would spread in the environment. Lynn Stembridge is the director of the Hanford Education Action League, or HEAL, and lives near the Hanford Reservation.
It was a huge experiment. It was not as direct as setting someone in a clinic and giving them a cup of orange juice laced with plutonium, but it was every bit as deliberate and every bit as unethical and immoral.
Nuclear weapons testing reflected another example of U.S. government indifference to the dangers of the nuclear age. Between 1951 and 1963, the Atomic Energy Agency detonated 126 nuclear bombs in the air above Nevada. In addition to the exposure of 250,000 soldiers and civilians who took part in the above-ground tests, there were thousands of downwinders who lost their livelihood, their health, and in many cases their lives to the drifting fallout clouds.
Atmospheric nuclear testing, I think, in some ways was the most devastating aspect of nuclear weapons production.
Dr. Arjan Muktajani is president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research and an expert on the environmental impact of nuclear weapons production.
We did some calculations from global nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere and calculated that by the end of the next century, hundreds of thousands of people would have died from cancer as a result of radiation doses.
On December 7, 1993, Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary opened the door to reveal the nation's nuclear skeletons. Secretary O'Leary announced that the United States government had secretly conducted radiation experiments on hundreds of unsuspecting adults and children in the 1940s and 1950s.
What I felt upon hearing the information, which was interestingly enough known to a very narrow community, was our government did that.
In addition to the nuclear weapons-related activities, the legacy of nuclear bomb-making is soiled by the routine dumping of radioactive wastes at bomb sites around the nation, posing a potential health and safety threat to some 600,000 workers and millions of residents of nearby communities. Radiation exposure has been linked to higher rates of cancer, leukemia, brain tumors, thyroid disorders, birth defects, sterility, and miscarriages.
And I couldn't have told you prior to the fall of '84 what they did at this facility. There were red and white checkerboard water towers. There was a red and white checkerboard square on the sign. It said Feed Materials Production Center. I think Purina and a whole lot of other people did too. You know, nobody ever talked about radiation or, you know, chemicals in wells or, you know, radioactive dust being released into your air.
Lisa Crawford, a housewife who lived near the Fernald uranium processing plant, recalls being told by a Department of Energy official that it was okay to drink her well water, even though it was contaminated with radioactive waste. She invited a DOE representative to drink the water.
So my husband and I went to a public meeting and I took a jar of water right out of my tap. And I sat it down and said, I want to see you drink this. You know, you keep telling me it's fine and it won't hurt me or my family, and they wouldn't drink it. We have a lot of people in the community who've had cancer. We Fresh did a map, a cancer map of the area, and we have well over 300 names on this map. The persistent diseases we tend to find are colon cancer, breast cancer, and kidney cancer.
In Washington State, Lynn Stembridge is concerned about the impact of the dumping of radioactive wastewater into the Columbia River.
They pulled water out of the Columbia River, ran that water right over the fuel rods, and dumped that water, steaming hot, laced with radiation, right back into the Columbia River. The anecdotal information is that it has definitely impacted on people's health. What has happened to people in their communities around the Pacific Northwest, paints just an absolutely incredible picture, not just thyroid disorders and not just cancer, but reproductive disorders and immune system deficiencies and alarmingly high incidence of MS through that part of the world.
A tragic legacy of the Cold War is that public health was sacrificed on the altar of nuclear bomb making. Dr. Muktajani describes why the process is so polluting.
Plutonium is produced with uranium as a raw material. You put uranium in a reactor and irradiate it with neutrons, and then some of the uranium becomes plutonium. Then you have to take that. It's mixed up with a lot of highly radioactive materials from the reactor, which are made in the reactor. You have to put that in a big chemical tank with nitric acid and other materials, and you separate the plutonium from everything else. And since everything else is the majority of the stuff that you have in the reactor, you get a very large quantity of extremely radioactive waste, which is left over from plutonium production.
The United States stopped processing uranium for bombs in 1964 and ceased plutonium production in 1988. But before ending production, we had produced about 89 metric tons of plutonium and 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium for weapons.
Plutonium is essentially a man-made heavy element. It's a metal. It's very toxic from a carcinogenic point of view. That is, a small amount of plutonium inside your body, if it is lodged there, can cause cancer.
It might seem that the radioactive threat is only a problem for people who live close to bomb-making facilities. Not so, suggests Dr. Muktajani.
This remote place called Hanford is an agricultural area. Wheat is grown there. Your Yakima apples are grown not very far from there, and so on. So there's a reason when you sit at your dining table to remember Eastern Washington.
I'd say Hanford itself may not be your problem, but chances are with 17 major Department of Energy facilities, with fallout from the Nevada test site, with various and sundry radiation experiments going on at medical facilities and universities, my hunch is it probably is right next door to you.
There's roughly 17 facilities throughout the country that were involved in nuclear bomb making. Virtually all of them have environmental problems, and virtually all of them are closed for environmental health and safety reasons today.
Victor Resendez has studied the issue for the General Accounting Office.
The contamination of these sites varies according to the production that was done there. All of them have typical industrial solvents and hazardous waste that would be involved in most manufacturing processes. Coupled with that is radiological waste that was mixed with these hazardous wastes. And a lot of the materials seep down through the soil and basically contaminated the groundwater.
Just to give you a sense of how much waste is involved, there are 177 high-level waste tanks at Hanford. And these are not your small 55-gallon drums. When I say tank, I really mean tank. They range from 500,000 gallons to more than 1 million gallons each. Fernald has got the largest store of radium wastes in the country, sitting in 2 deteriorating silos whose structures have been compromised.
I think folks that live around Fernald just kind of live from day to day, and you just hope for the best, and we continue to just fight and push very, very hard for, you know, a total, I won't say a total cleanup of this site, but a good comprehensive cleanup of this site, because we're never going to go back to the way we were.
Decades of abuse have left an estimated 4,500 contaminated production sites around the country. 9 nuclear weapons facilities have qualified for inclusion on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund National Priorities list of the worst contaminated sites in America. Parts of some nuclear weapons facilities are so contaminated they may have to be sealed off forever from public access, becoming what some have referred to as national sacrifice zones. Secretary of the Department of Energy, Hazel O'Leary, has created a new openness in the government's dealing with the legacy of nuclear weapons production.
So one of the major challenges is to articulate clearly cleanup milestones, which we have done for fiscal year 94 and 95.
Give me an example of what that would mean. What would be a milestone?
And clean up 25 sites entirely by the end of fiscal year 1995. Boom. began substantial cleanup on another 110.
The massive cleanup task facing the DOE will prove to be one of the most expensive government programs in the history of our nation.
A few years ago, 5 years ago, the department estimated the total cleanup would be $100 billion.
In 1995, the Energy Department revised this estimate to $230 billion over 75 years, a period exceeding the average lifespan of Americans. This massive undertaking involves decontaminating, decommissioning, and dismantling as many as 700 buildings, reactors, and other structures within the nuclear weapons complex. The culture of secrecy associated with nuclear weapons production has been an impediment to dealing with the problem.
Everything that was done at these facilities was cloaked in heavy secrecy. In addition, the department and its predecessor agencies were also shielded from the various kinds of oversight and environmental laws that the country was gradually coming to grips with.
The Department of Energy said, we're a good neighbor. We haven't hurt the environment, and no one has been hurt by what we've done. And Heal responded by saying, that's wonderful. Show us the documents that prove that. Unfortunately, what happened every time they produced a document was it said the exact opposite.
Someone found at one of our sites a one-line contract. It said, this is a contract to build a secret weapon. That was it.
One of the worst examples of abuse occurred at the Rocky Flats Plutonium Processing Facility, located 16 miles northwest of Denver. After a 1989 raid by FBI agents, the former plant operator, Rockwell International, pled guilty to 10 charges of violating environmental laws. Rockwell was fined $18.5 million. While that sounds like a lot of money, it was actually $3.8 million less than bonuses the U.S. government paid to Rockwell during the period in question.
I think they should absolutely be held liable. I think that a lot of these people have gotten away with murder, and they have cost the taxpayers of this country a lot of money, and we are all going to pay for this over the next 30 years to even begin to try to clean up these sites.
As a result of previous abuses, Secretary O'Leary has called for major contractor reform.
The old regime simply said, do the job. If you do it, if it takes you 5 months longer to do the job, fine, we'll pay you for that too. That's unacceptable. I think there can be a better sharing of the burden. Now that's frightening to the contractors. They're going to have to live with that.
Under the Environmental Restoration Management contract, the contractor is paid based on the progress he makes in actually cleaning up the facility.
Past secretaries of energy have overseen a department that has overemphasized nuclear weapons production and minimized or even ignored environmental concerns.
It was damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. We don't care who we hurt. We're going to do this.
In the last few years, there have been changes at the Department of Energy, particularly under the stewardship of Hazel O'Leary.
And we have public participation. We have a lot of it. I mean, sometimes we have it to the point where we can't fit anything else on our plates here.
Because DOE is more open to it, you're saying?
The DOE has opened up the door. It was open about this much, and now I think it's open about halfway. We've got some more to go here.
I think it's clear that protecting the environment was certainly not a top priority in the department. What you do is you look at the history and you look at several things. One, I don't think people clearly understood who were doing the work, certainly at inception, the danger.
The response of the Department of Energy has been more forthright, certainly under this administration. I will say, however, that there is a great deal of history retrofitting going on. It's frequently discussions of past experiments or past pollution is frequently couched in, well, they just didn't know better, that was a different time. And the fact of the matter is they knew darn well that they were over even the high limits that were on the books at that time. And I've seen documents where at one point they thought perhaps they should close the Columbia River to fishing, but they did not do it because they thought it would probably be a public relations disaster. So for the Department of Energy to say they didn't know, that's a lie.
While the debate on the environmental legacy of the nuclear arms race is more open, No solutions have yet been found on where to permanently store the radioactive waste produced by the nuclear weapons complex. Congress created the Yucca Mountain site in Nevada, mostly for civilian wastes, but high-level military wastes will be sent there as well. Another site in New Mexico will handle less radioactive material. The projects have been delayed because there are huge problems to be solved before the sites are ready.
Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years. So the question is, do you just bury the plutonium someplace for 24,000 years and assume that no one will dig it up or mine it or somehow stumble across it?
And there remains the problem of the tanks where wastes are currently being held. A 1957 waste tank explosion in Russia left large parts of the surrounding countryside uninhabitable.
We've got these wastes in tanks at Hanford and Savannah River. Especially the ones at Hanford are going to pose very severe problems. We put the wastes in the tanks, but we don't know how to get them out. These wastes are very complex in their nature. They're radioactive. They contain explosive materials. So assume that Yucca Mountain was the perfect place to bury radioactive waste forever. The big question is, can we get those wastes out of the tanks, and have we developed the technology?
Some of the scientists propose we can encapsulate this material, radioactive material, in these glass bricks. And that's great. The glass will take care of it, and that's it. We can put it down deep geologic storage, never have to worry about it again. Well, so we had them go ahead and start doing some of this stuff, getting ready for it. Well, they found out that after about, I think it was 2 or 2.5 years, some of this glass that they had thought was going to be so permanent was leaching out. The glass was cracking, material was coming out. It was not nearly as good as we thought.
Even if a safe, reliable storage method is agreed upon by the government and scientific community, how do we mark the site to prevent future generations from disturbing the repository? A team of scientists, educators, creative writers, and futurists have devised a few suggested signposts to warn away future generations. But serious concerns remain.
Those are extraordinary time periods we're talking about. Recorded history is only 5,000 years. Understanding geology, understanding how climate changes and various other things change over hundreds of years, let alone 1,000 years, is very, very difficult. Those are very complex issues, one that we have to study very carefully.
When looking at the problem of nuclear waste cleanup and disposal, it is clear that the Congress must play a larger role, not just in pushing for more effective cleanup programs, but for ensuring that Americans are told the truth about the dangers involved, and for guaranteeing all our citizens a voice in cleanup decisions.
And I think our role has got to be to keep the pressure on this, keep the budget flowing to make sure the cleanup continues. That's the way we make this country safe for everybody.
My goal is to squeeze the cost out of these contracts, to get value for every taxpayer dollar paid, and to hold folks accountable to deliver what we say they should.
And I think Congress should assist that process with, on the positive side, not always wield the stick, but assist the Environment, Safety, and Health Department with more funds and personnel and elbow room. I think financial accountability without kind of wielding a butcher knife to the cleanup budgets is also very important.
In 1996, the Clinton administration proposed spending $6 billion on nuclear weapons cleanup and waste management. This is more than any previous administration, but the Republican-led Congress is looking to cut the program significantly. In any case, this represents only a fraction of the $230 billion needed to complete the job.
The other major challenge is to keep the cost reasonable. One of the things we've discovered here is, are we paying a fair price for cleanup? Well, we've discovered that we were not. The federal government was paying 30% more for projects than its private sector counterparts.
If you figure somewhere over $200 billion is going to be required to do the cleanup job, and it's going to require 20 to 30 years, that's pretty simple math. You're going to have somewhere around $8 to $10 billion a year on a steady basis. And it's going to take that kind of steady funding and steady government support to really get this problem under control and eradicate it once and for all.
The legacy of nuclear bomb making is a costly one. America will pay the price for centuries with our tax dollars, our health, and our peace of mind. In the headlong rush to garner security through the stockpiling of nuclear bombs, our nation wound up endangering the well-being of its own citizens, its own communities. Americans must now demand full accountability from their government, not only for the mistakes of the past, but for keeping their promises in the future. Cleaning up and storing the toxic wastes of the nuclear arms race will demand new technologies, adequate budgets, efficient government oversight and follow-through, and an openness that will bring citizens into the decision-making process. By seeking further reductions in nuclear stockpiles and ending all efforts to develop new nuclear weapons, we can ensure that future generations won't stumble blindly into a new nuclear age.
What you have just heard and seen clearly illustrates the dangerous legacy of the nuclear arms race, but it even more clearly illustrates the need to make democracy work in America. As head of the Department of Energy, Secretary O'Leary has acted in the true spirit of democracy by uncovering the deceptions which have masked our problems. Americans should insist that all government officials are equally open and equally ready to act to solve our pollution problems. We must do this so that our children and their children can grow up in a clean America. Join us next week for another hot issue as we look at the likely dangers posed by the spread of nuclear weapons in the 21st century. For America's Defense Monitor, I am Jack Shanahan.
If you would like to receive a free printed Defense Monitor on the environmental legacy of the nuclear arms race, contact the Center for Defense Information at 1500 Massachusetts Avenue, Washington, D.C., 20005, or call 1-800-CDI 3334.
For more information on this subject or related topics, or to purchase a videocassette or transcript of this program, contact America's Defense Monitor at 1500 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20005, or call 1-800-CDI 3334. When ordering, you can use Visa or MasterCard, and be sure to include the show title or number. You can also contact us via our internet site at www.cdi.org.